So, picking up from the first part of the discussion of the Enlightenment, we have entered into the idea of the social contract theory, which John Locke proposes. He proposed these ideas in an essay called Concerning Human Understanding in the year 1690. And he brings forth an idea called tabula rasa, which means basically a blank mind, that all humans were born with a blank mind. In his own words, this is from the essay itself, he says, quote, "Let us then suppose the mind to be, as we say, white paper, void of all characters, without any ideas. How comes it to be furnished? Whence comes it that vast store which the busy and boundless fancy of man has painted on it with an almost endless variety? Whence has it all the materials of reason and knowledge? To this I answer in one word, from experience. Our observation, employed either about external sensible objects or about the internal operations of our minds, perceived and reflected on by ourselves, is that which supplies our understanding with all the materials of thinking." End quote. In other words, the blank slate, tabula rasa, what Locke is saying is that we are born with no innate ideas. We're not born with with moral concepts, or we should do this or not do that. All of that is developed as we are young children, actually probably within the first 5 or 6 years of our life. And from those experiences, we then develop our own world view. So for instance, in this world, Locke would be saying, if you were born into Europe in it doesn't really matter, but the 15th, the 16th, the 17th century, you would be born into a world where your parents teach you that the ultimate authority is the Catholic Church. They have all moral authority, all intellectual authority, and that the only other authority is the king, queen, emperor, prince, whatever. But even those people follow the rules of the Catholic Church and the Pope. And so you must understand that's an extraordinary concept, that we're not born with that, but rather we're taught that. From experience, we learn it, much like the child who touches a hot stove and burns his hand, and from that experience is not because his mother or father says don't touch the stove. They may have said that many times, but the child now learns that if I touch the hot stove, it burns and it hurts, and so the child doesn't do it again. And the child has learned then from experience. It was not an innate thing that the child understood. When something feels warm, don't touch it. Only the experience allowed for that. And so that allows so what Locke and Hobbes have presented here allows for the expansion of these ideas of that you could basically create a new society. If you changed what one generation believed, you could basically end the intellectual, moral, religious, however you want to put it, authority of one institution or two institutions, the state and the church. And that within a couple of generations, by being taught, people could free their minds and they could believe only what they are able to experience, i.e. the scientific method. That throws such things as faith out the window. If you can't see it, if you can't feel it, if you can't smell it, then it's not real. And so these are the basic ideas of the Enlightenment. As I said with Locke, the social contract theory is again where humans decided we must put someone in charge. So both Hobbes and Locke come to the conclusion that a government structure is necessary. But then the question of what is the role of the government? Is it to rule us completely, to deny us any human and basic rights? And they say, well, no. And so it's these Enlightenment thinkers of the 18th century, like Montesquieu, like Voltaire, like Diderot, like Beccaria, who then pick that up and look at different aspects of, as I said, whether it's government or politics or religion or economics, and they look at these with the idea of throwing away believing things based on traditions, faith, etc., and now looking at them and trying to discover what the laws are that govern those concepts. So, the idea then of the Enlightenment thinkers is to improve human nature, right? Using what they would call reason, capital R reason, their highest virtue, what we would now probably today call logic, using our logic, our reason. And so I want to look at some of these particular individuals. The map you're now looking at shows you that it was this Enlightenment was happening all over Europe. You can see that there's sort of a major point of these ideas being shared between London, Paris, and Amsterdam. But you also have figures of the Enlightenment as far away as Prussia, such as Immanuel Kant, and even kings and queens and czars, such as Catherine the Great of Russia, Joseph II of the Austrian Empire, and so on. So this was a vastly large, interconnected, interwoven group that discussed these ideas by writing to one another, and they basically then argued amongst each other through their writings about, well, yes, I agree with that, I don't agree with this, and here's why, etc. So it is a world of sharing new ideas and new concepts. Immanuel Kant sort of gave them the motto, if you will, of the Enlightenment, which was dare to know, have courage to use your own intelligence. Therefore, don't believe what you've heard. Don't believe necessarily what your parents tell you, what the church tells you, what the state tells you, but find this information out on your own from your own experiences. The major Enlightenment principles, again, are that religion, tradition, and superstition are things that only limit our independent thoughts. Therefore, they must be done away with, basically. You should only accept knowledge that is based on observation, logic, reason, not faith. Also, that the scientific and academic community should be secular, that is not a part of the church or state, because they only limit these things. So, who are the major Enlightenment thinkers? Well, they're mostly from France, and they were known as the philosophes, which is just French for philosopher. And again, their thinking here is to change the world, to change people's thinking about the world. The major figures I want to look at are one, Montesquieu. Montesquieu was from French nobility, and he wanted to look further at the idea of government and how governments were formed and what the best form of government is. Again, looking at the laws of nature which govern government. He wrote the book called The Spirit of the Laws, in which he used the scientific method to find the natural laws that govern the social and political relationships of human beings. In doing so, he basically identifies three major groups of government, or basic groups of government. One would be a republic for smaller states. Two would be a despotic government for larger states. I'm sure he's talking here about France and the absolutist state. And three, monarchies for moderately sized states such as England. And England becomes the model for basically all the Enlightenment thinkers of, if there is a best form of government as it is right now, it is that of England, where, as Montesquieu points out, you have the separation of powers. Right, you have a parliament with a House of Commons and a House of Lords, and then you also have the king, and they and you actually by this point have a judicial system, and so these things all check and balance one another. Not one becomes too powerful. Therefore, the idea of the separation of powers keeps a government from becoming too powerful, too authoritarian, because they're constantly basically working off of each other and checking and balancing one another. If this sounds familiar, it's because, of course, it is the system that the United States adopts, and that will have a judicial, legislative, and executive branch all checking each other. So Montesquieu would say, yes, that this English concept of government is the best going. Voltaire agreed with that. Voltaire, also French, from a middle-class family, not nobility. He had been exiled for his ideas, Enlightenment ideas that the church didn't like, the state didn't like. He was exiled to England, where he discovered that England had basically the best thing going, based on the Magna Carta, based on limited monarchy, as we've discussed previously. Voltaire was without a doubt the most influential and greatest figure of the Enlightenment. He wrote pamphlets, novels, plays, letters, essays, and histories based on Enlightenment thinking. He's probably best known for his criticism of Christianity and his strong belief in religious tolerance, which he puts forward in his book, The Treatise on Toleration, in which he philosophized that, quote, all men are brothers under God, end quote. And it was Voltaire who spread many of the ideas to kings and queens and czars throughout Europe, particularly that of Frederick the Great of Prussia. Voltaire spent actual good amounts of time living with Frederick the Great, and sort of bouncing these certain ideas off, which therefore in our next videos we'll discuss enlightened absolutism, where some of these absolutists like Frederick the Great or Catherine the Great adopt Enlightenment thinking, which betters the lives of the ordinary citizens for which they rule. The second to last figure, Diderot. He was responsible for collecting what was known as the Encyclopedia, a 28-volume collection of knowledge that was published over 20 years. And it was Enlightenment thinking from all the Enlightenment thinkers. And it was used as a way, once again, to spread knowledge of the Enlightenment throughout Europe, particularly in this case to the wealthy and to the monarchs, because again, not your average person could read, and also they couldn't afford a 28-volume set. So Diderot has a very important place in spreading the ideas of the Enlightenment to those at the top. And the last person is Beccaria. And Beccaria looks at sort of criminal punishment. And his book on crimes and punishment basically puts forward the idea that torture, murder by the state should never be used, and that punishment ultimately should only happen in the most dire of situations. In other words, the state does not have the right to take a citizen's life away. And of course, we're still dealing with this question today of the death penalty and so on. And the last thing is how these things spread through two main ways. There was a growth of reading during the 18th century. More people could read newspapers, magazines, etc. And there were the so-called salons, in which wealthy people got together and